This episode is on the Antebellum South. Ante means before, bellum is Latin for war. So this episode is on the pre-Civil War South, which means we are looking at South as it was under the institution of slavery. In the period that we're talking about, they would call it with the euphemism the peculiar institution. So that was a euphemism for the slavery and the slave society that existed in the South. So what we want to look at today is that slave society, and remember that you're going to contrast it with the North and the national industrial society with all of the canals and railroads and roadways that were growing up in the North, and industry that's growing in the North, and a free wage labor society in the North. So that's what our comparison is. And in the South, it's a very different world. It was re-energized in the late 18th century by an invention by Eli Whitney, who invented in 1793 a new cotton gin. And the cotton gin took the seeds out of cotton without having people there to have to pick them out. So it made it much easier to get the seed that is all through each little cotton ball out of the cotton ball. And that meant that they could process even more cotton with this cotton gin. So it would revitalize the South and the slave economy. And as more cotton was produced, demand kept going up for that cotton. And especially by the North, obviously industrial textile producers, but also by Britain. Britain was really in high demand of cotton in this day and age. Now they also had to transform the planting of cotton by a new strand of cotton that was known as short staple cotton. This short staple cotton would grow anywhere. So now they could plant many different soils all through the South, and it would revitalize not just the cotton industry, but also expand into what is known as the Deep South, and that's where we'll end this lecture. So the short staple cotton then is a genetically improved cotton in the sense that it could be planted anywhere. Again, Britain became the major buyer of the South's cotton. They bought up to 75% of what was produced in the South. So the South assumed that that Britain would support the South if war were to come. Now this didn't quite happen. They do help them somewhat, but they weren't full on in support of the South, and they definitely did not loan them much money to fight their war against the North. All right, so let's look at plantation society, and the central political power in plantation society, of course, are the planters. But it's important to know just about how many. We know that there were about 1,733 families that owned more than 100 slaves. Now that's very few families in a population that had about 1 million people. But these families were the people that controlled the politics, and that's what's important about them. When you have a few people who are running political institutions, we consider it an aristocracy. So while the South was not a aristocracy by law, it was in fact an aristocracy by the social structure. The men were expected to be planters or expected to be soldiers, and they also operated according to an ethical code that we call chivalry, where they not only fought, but they were expected to take care of those who were weaker or who were under them or under their protection. And that's the central part of the chivalric code, that you're a warrior and you are a protector of those who are under you in one way or the other. The most prominent of which, of course, were the women that were married to these planters, and they were essentially ornaments and expected to be obedient to the males that were their I don't want to use the term overseer, but were their guardians, whether it was their father or their husbands, or if those are their older brothers. So that was part of their position, but they were not free of obligation, so they had to maintain the household and the household staff. So there was a lot to do in a large plantation in particular to run a household, and so that's what these women did, in fact. Of course, there were all sorts of ceremonies that came up around being a woman or a man in this culture as well. Probably the most famous of which is the coming out of the young girls when they were 16 and of marriageable age. The plantation economy, of course, was dominated by agriculture, and it was dominated by an agriculture, cotton, which exhausts the soil very quickly. We know that here in the valley because we have cotton fields, especially as you go west, and those cotton farmers have to be very careful because it will eat up the nutrients of the soil very quickly. So fertilizers are very important to cotton production, and not always possible in the early 19th century and the society that we're talking about. It tended towards monopolistic conditions, so the large plantations ate up small plantations by buying them out, usually, or the small plantations going into debt. And they went into debt because prices were often uncertain, so prices in agriculture in general bounce around. They can be quite good and high, and then sometimes they can drop so low that it won't cover your costs. So that lent itself to some of the risk involved in the agricultural production. In addition to that, instability of prices, land and land speculation could be dicey, and so was part of the risk, and especially if land prices were going up, it was very risky for somebody who was borrowing the money to buy land and try to produce on it. And finally, just the cost of slaves was very high. Now I have $1,200 written here. Slaves obviously cost different prices in this day and age, and you can go see manifests where they have listed the price that slaves were sold for in auctions. $1,200 is the price for an slave that was between 15 and 25 years old, male, and very strong. And so this basically is your best worker you could get, and that would cost you about $1,200 for that slave. That's easily the price of a tractor in this day and age, if you need some comparison. So that was a very expensive item to have, and so didn't make it easy for the small farmer. Everything here conspires against the small farmer and for the aristocratic elite and the monopolists. Right? They were producing and supplying, as they saw it, Yankee, it should be in quotes, they call it Yankee manufacturing. So when the South goes to war, they're a little bit astonished at the New England manufacturers who are obviously at war with them, but thinking that, well, they need us, right? We're agrarian, but they need us. Also, since it was a society of slavery, the Europeans were not as anxious to immigrate. It was a monopolistic world as well, so it was very difficult to immigrate. So most immigration went north, and very little came from Europe, came into the South. Of course, there was a white majority. Slave owners made up about a quarter of the white population. The white population was about 8 million when we get to 1860 and the beginning of the Civil War. So that means there are 6 million non-slave owners in the South, and most of them were relatively poor. The South didn't have a lot of large cities. It didn't have as much urbanization as the North, so we often considered them backcountry, or this is the sort of stereotypical ordinary person out of the white person out of the South. They were inspired by the Second Great Awakening and the revivals, and many of them joined Baptist and Methodist sects, religious sects. There was a derogatory term for these either poor or middling poor whites in the South, and that was cracker. The origin of that derogatory term is non-specific, although it has been suspected that it was because they were often hired on as overseers by the large plantation owners and therefore cracked whips, and so the term cracker was applied to the lower middle class and poor whites in the South. They had two things that would have inspired them, for better or for worse. One was the hope of mobility. Everybody in America had that hope of mobility, and the idea of racial superiority. So they saw themselves as better than the black slaves that were on the plantations and small farms. So those were the two things on which they sort of continued their existence. I should say the three things, right? Christianity, and then those human attributes, right? The proclivity for hope and the idea that you're better than the next person under you. So sad but true about those that were not part of the plantation owning class. Then there were the even poorer people in the mountains, and these were the mountain whites, and we get the term actually hillbilly from this. They lived in the Appalachian Mountains, which cut down through the South, and they did not like either the slave or the slave owner. So they were hostile to both the slave and the slave-owning class, and they were so poor often that slaves saw themselves as better and superior to these hillbillies or these mountain whites. They're an interesting group of people because they would be very helpful to the Yankees in the Civil War who came down, the Northerners who were fighting the South, and so they tended to side with them when they came into the South to fight against the slave-owning class. Free blacks. There were free blacks both in the North and the South. The South had about 250,000 free blacks, some of them freed by plantation owners, and some of them had their freedom from very early on during the colonial period. Some fought in the Revolution, and so by the time we get to 1860, we have about 250,000, basically, free blacks. Many of them were part white and part black, and that term that was used for that was mulatto. They often had bought their freedom or earned their freedom, and they were in a very vulnerable position because there were slave catchers for slaves that had escaped plantations, etc., and sometimes they could be subject to that. So if you were a free black, in other words, in the South, you did not want to leave your community where everybody knew your status. It could be dicey to go anywhere else. In the North, we also had approximately 250,000 free blacks, and that they were part of the working population, usually lived in their own communities, were subject to racism and oppression in the North. I mean, we do have instances when they participated in politics, for example, in Pennsylvania, at least originally after the Revolutionary War. But for the most part, they lived in their own communities, and they had a hard time competing with white wage laborers, and so we're subject to lots of racism and oppression. Slavery in the South had included a population of about 4 million. So you want to look at that. You have about 8 million whites, and you have about 4 million slaves and blacks. And they constituted approximately $2 billion in investment, which is clearly a profit for the slave owners. $2 billion in investment, that was serious. So when it came to the federal government trying to stop slavery, they were really up against it with the slave-owning class who controlled politics, and for whom this slave society was not just a long tradition, but also a very expensive investment for them. So if you're wondering why the South was going to fight and fight doggedly, those are all the reasons that they were. It was an entrenched social tradition. It was a very expensive investment for them, and so meant a lot in terms of profit for the planters. This would keep the economy in the South backward. And when you say backward economy, we usually are referring to economies that haven't industrialized. So the South had no incentive to industrialize because its agricultural economy was making lots of money for it. In addition to that, you want to add that the other phenomenon that in 1808 the Western international community had banned the Atlantic slave trade. So slavery was no longer legal in Europe and or the United States, and take that back. Slavery was the trading of slaves, the shipping of slaves from Africa to the Americas was considered illegal by 1808. But that meant that the internal slave trade was not. So from 1808, 1810 to 1860, slaves in America, the slave population grew, and it grew from a natural reproduction. The statistic that I think your book has, and that many books do have, is that it went in 1830 from 2 million to 4 million by 1860. So it was expanding rapidly, and that was due to many things in the South, but they did practice forced breeding, and they had their own auctions where they bought and sold slaves, and that was, again, an internal slave trade inside the United States, so it wasn't an international slave trade. And if you want an account of that, that's part of what made Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, famous, was that she wrote about slave auctions and wrote that into the book, and just how unhuman the slave auction was. The slave's life, of course, was, generally speaking, hard work out in the fields. Most of them were involved in agriculture, although some of them were not. They were not allowed to have an education, and you want to note that in your readings in Frederick Douglass's autobiography. He talks about how one woman was going to give him an education, and her husband said, "Do not do that because you will make him not a good slave." And so keeping the slave population was very important to the South, is what Frederick Douglass's message is. With ignorance, it's easy to oppress people, and obviously in the state of slavery they were subject to oppression legally, but they also had to contend, especially on large plantations where most of the slaves were, with the overseer. And again, you want to consult Frederick Douglass on this, because the overseers he represents are very cruel and brutal men who have their responsibility is to keep slaves working and to get as much production out of them as he can. And so Frederick Douglass probably, without any doubt, was right about the overseer, that the plantation owner brought him on and he had to use brutal methods to get slaves to work. So those brutal methods that we learn about in Douglass are especially floggings, but making sure the slaves are up early, they work all day long, especially in the harvesting period, upwards of 16 hours. A slave clearly had no legal rights. He's not a citizen. I mean, there was some small things, protections he might have, in the sense that it was illegal to kill a slave, but proving that somebody had killed a slave was another thing. So they did have minimal protection. They could not give testimony in a court. So there was very little legal protection for the slave. This picture is a slave family in a cabin area on a large plantation. You can see here they're all together, not a great life, so there's not a lot to smile about, and so they look pretty hard worked. but people don't really take pictures with smiles on in this day and age, so it's hard to tell, right? Slave life on the large plantations, that's where the majority of slaves lived. They would usually have, like this picture shows, their own cabin area and community, so they had time to cultivate their own cultural features when they were not in work. There was a split between those that were the domestic slaves and those that were the field hands. And Douglas mentions this, that the domestic slaves saw themselves as superior to the field hands. The slaves also had their own cabins, and they would cultivate their own gardens for food. So there was some freedom from white overseers, or the white planting class, after the work was all done. If they were on small farms, it was not like that, so they didn't have their own time away, and they were under the constant surveillance of the small plantation owner, and it tended to be more intimate, and they were tended to be that they were more likely to be subject to punishment. Otherwise, the work was very much the same. Urban slaves often had a little bit more freedom, not always, but if you were in towns, there wasn't quite as much work that needed to be done, so you could have more free time, or you could sometimes be hired out or hire yourself out to do work. And this is where slaves often bought their freedom. If they were slave to a slave owner who would allow them to go work on their own, they could earn money to buy their own freedom, and that's where we get some of the slave population that we have, some of the freeman population that we have prior to the Civil War. Here's a picture then of the Deep South. So that's the slave's life. But what you want to notice about, not a picture, a map, what you want to notice about this map is the orange area. And the orange area is short staple or short fiber cotton. So you want to see that, boy, they planted, and this is the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. But this whole Deep South, these 5 states, is really majority planted with short staple cotton. That's just incredible. And then you can see too tobacco farming up here in Kentucky and Texas, and then in the Virginia area, and finally corn in the blue areas. So those are the 3 big crops. I wanted to just point out a couple of other things for you. That rice here, this little stick-looking figure, was planted along the coastline and down in New Orleans. And sugar is always a big question for us. They couldn't plant it really in the United States, but they do plant some in Louisiana, and then you can see it down here in Texas a little bit, but very little. Sugar just grew in the Caribbean, but it did not grow on the continent. All right, so the Deep South, up to 75% in the Deep South. So the Deep South now, we're talking again about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and to some extent South Carolina. Up to 75% in some communities could be slaves. And when the Civil War is over, these people took over the communities sometimes. These areas then with large plantation often had stable families. They were attracted by the religions of the Second Great Awakening again. So most of them were Christians. A lot of them took up with the Baptist sects, and they were particularly attracted to Christianity because of stories like Moses, who led his people to freedom. And we do get spirituals that represent that tale in particular, or that biblical story in particular. So the whole idea of freedom was deep in the African American community, even especially, I guess I should say, because they were slaves. So when we see the Civil War over and the potential for freedom given to African Americans, they go for it in a big way. I mean, nobody, or almost nobody, wanted to remain a slave. There were few that did remain with their slave owners, but for the most part, most blacks left their condition as slave and adopted and embraced freedom quite anxiously.